Everyone, I am really excited to present a small part of my research that I'm currently working on as part of a larger project for my thesis. So in my thesis, I am seeking to compare the different modalities through which France and Britain sought to acquire, curate, and disseminate knowledge about Egypt so that I might examine how ancient Egypt was rediscovered, or really perhaps the better word is reimagined through the British-French rivalry in the aftermath of Napoleon's failed expedition in Egypt. But for the purposes of this presentation, I will be presenting my research on the textual description modality from 1802 till 1822. Now, the title of my presentation is inspired by one of the most important textual descriptions to come out of Napoleon's expedition, the monumental Description de l'Egypte. Now, the preface to this massive document justifies why the French were in Egypt, and the language used harks back to the great scholars and conquerors, implying that the French are literally following in the footsteps of Homer, Plato, Caesar, and Augustus. They are collecting and rewriting the history of the greats by using this encyclopedic document as a form of collecting and disseminating ancient Egyptian history. Yet the description was not the first nor the only publication that came out of this failed Egyptian campaign. That honor belonged to Dominique Vivant Denon, whose book, Voyage dans le Bas Elat d'Egypte in 1802, birthed a fascination with ancient Egypt and led to the establishment of a network of information in which British and French authors traveled to Egypt to verify each other's descriptions and findings of the ancient ruins and artifacts. However, this prerogative changed in 1821 when Giovanni Battista Belzoni's book, Travels in Egypt and Nubia, was published. Now, in fairness, Belzoni was probably trying to add to this network of information. However, his book placed British-French rivalry over the acquisition of ancient Egyptian artifacts at the center. It was Belzoni's book and a children's book later inspired by his travels that reshaped this network of information that the travelogue writers had worked so hard to create. And instead, it demonstrated the public's interest with British-French rivalry rather than this network of information. Thus, we see the British turning their focus to the public as a means to collect and assert dominance over ancient Egypt. But in comparison, the French sought to assert their dominance through academic publications such as the encyclopedic Description de l'Egypte. Now, I think it is important to take a moment really quickly to talk about several historians who have gone before. They have analyzed the description. They've asked why Belzoni and Denon were so successful and popular in both France and in Britain. However, they have not asked how they fit into the framework of the British and French using textual description as a means to collect ancient Egypt. So I feel like that is something new that I'm able to bring to the table. Now, the closest comparative work to what I've done was done by Andrew Badarsky, as you see pictured here. However, in his book, he is tracking the description sales in Britain. And what he is doing is he uses Belzoni and Denon's books to compare what was most popular and asks why. He does not, however, delve into the idea of a public versus an academic approach to collecting ancient Egypt through textual description. So that's something new I'm adding to it. And instead, my research reveals that despite some British scholars' attempts to establish a thorough network of information, the British would ultimately adopt a form of collecting ancient Egypt by appealing to the public, and conversely, the French would do so through academic publications. Now, one of the first publications from the Egyptian campaign was by Denon in 1802, and his book was an instant success, both in France, where it underwent 20 separate editions, and in Britain, where less than a year after its publication, it was translated into English. Now, Denon's travelogue's popularity was a result of three things: its relevance, intriguing content, and thorough description. It was relevant. It came only a few years after Napoleon's expedition. It was intriguing as it talks not only about the battles that Denon was able to witness Napoleon engage in, but also about this process of collecting Egypt alongside the other scientists and savants. And of course, it was thorough, as though the images included in the document are nothing compared to the precision seen in the description. His verbal descriptions are incredibly detailed, and in many cases, he tries to describe and picture the hieroglyphs, even though he admits he doesn't know what they mean. And I think examining his discussion of the hieroglyphs is a perfect starting point for understanding how Denon would begin a network of communication amongst the travelogues. The quote I have selected is from his preface and is on the left. It says, "In thinking of you, citizens, and of all the literati of Europe, I felt the resolution to copy, with a scrupulous nicety, the minute details of these dry and unmeaning paintings, which could not otherwise interest me than by aid of your intelligence." And so what we're seeing here is Denon is openly admitting that ancient Egyptian history is not currently fully understandable. The key is not there. They don't understand how to read hieroglyphs yet. However, he is still using his travelogue as a means to disseminate information about a topic he doesn't understand, but hopes will catch another scholar's attention. And so we see that he's making the decision to document them, believing that one day they will be understood and he will have contributed to piquing scholars' interests. Now, the British wholeheartedly embraced Denon's intellectual spirit. Academic reviewers sang his praises, celebrating his rigorous classification and description as a means to reveal Egypt to the world. They called his work an example of distinguished magnificence. Yet the reviews also indicate, and I think more interestingly, that they consider Denon to have put aside British-French rivalry in the pursuit of a more important endeavor: knowledge. As you can see below, the British Monthly Review says, "The English reader will peruse the journal of such a man with an interest, which will be increased by the humanity of his disposition, and by the traits of fairness in those parts of the narrative in which he might be expected to have been biased by his national prejudice." Thus, we see the British are crediting Denon with abandoning his prejudice and instead are commending him as a genuine historian who impartially observes and disseminates information. And I think this helps us understand why the British travelogue authors would use Denon as a foundation and later hark back to him as the forefather of this network of communication. Now, there are many, many authors who build on this network, both French and British, and I would love to take the time to go over all of them, but unfortunately I don't have all that much time. So I'm going to be focusing on 3 British authors to demonstrate how this network was constructed and how it functioned. And the first of these authors is William Richard Hamilton, who published his travelogue in 1809. Now, Hamilton is unique, and what is unique about his book is a statement in his preface. It explains that he's actually reluctant to publish this travelogue. It was a journal meant for himself. However, he explains that he was surprised that the French had yet to publish their findings in France. And he knows that Denon had published, but he expected something bigger from the French government. After all, Napoleon lugged a bunch of scientists to Egypt. So where is that material? Which, ironically, the description was in its final stages of publication at that time, but Hamilton didn't know that. And so he believed that the public deserved to share in the knowledge he had gained. So Hamilton's preface orients us to a really interesting conversation taking place. Where is the French publication? So we see that the British are waiting for this publication, but in the absence of this published material from France, Hamilton is willing to put forth his own personal account. Yet consistently throughout the narrative, he refers to Denon as the authority on the subject and really argues that his main job in creating his travelogue is to fill in the holes on the narrative. As you can see in the quote I have selected below, he often says little needs to be added to his narrative. He does, however, in a few cases indicate that Denon's description is not entirely suitable, but for the most part, he follows Denon's lead. Now, reviewers of Hamilton's work indicate that he did help strengthen this network of information that Denon set out to create. Now, similar to Hamilton, Thomas Lay helped enlarge this network of information, but he does so differently. Whereas Denon and Hamilton, they focused on describing the monuments, which in fairness, Lay does a little bit of, but his primary focus is to highlight the process of exploring Egypt, as he admits how well done the descriptions produced by the French are, particularly the description de l'Egypte. He often chooses to forego descriptions entirely, as he claims that Denon and Hamilton's work is so complete, but he is also very heavily criticized for his lack of descriptions, because part of what the travelogue authors were trying to do is describe what's going on so that scholars who can't go to Egypt at this time can still be informed and a part of the discussion. And so he's very heavily criticized for not adding as many descriptions as the previous authors did. But whereas Lay was heavily criticized, Light is incredibly celebrated. And I think that Light is a perfect example of this culmination of the network of information established by Denon. And there's 2 reasons for that. Number 1, he uses the existing accounts by Denon, by Hamilton, by Lay to inform his own. He knows where to go, he knows where to look, he knows what to do because he's accessing this network of information. And number 2, he doesn't just use it, but he adds to it. So, and he does it differently than Hamilton did, whereas Hamilton was just filling in the holes in Denon's narrative. Light says, well, let me expand it differently. Whereas Denon and Hamilton, they had focused on Thebes. Now we see Light expanding it in his research to Philae. So we can see that the historical community was growing and mostly free of French-British rivalry in the sense that these authors weren't doing this to help establish intellectual authority for their nation or their country. Instead, they were more focused on establishing a network of information that they could all draw from. However, everything changed with the publication of Belzoni's book. Now, Belzoni's book followed a similar layout to Denon's, and it was meant to tell a similar tale, the story of a man who was able to persevere all in the goal of pursuing knowledge, an admirable undertaking. However, unlike Denon's book that claimed to be free of bias, Belzoni's book was very clearly in favor of the British, and in fact, he says so in his preface. But more importantly, Belzoni did something that the previous authors had been unable to do. His book was not merely descriptions of the artifacts, but it also detailed how he moved them and brought them back to England for the British Museum. In doing this, he not only described what he saw, but was able to show physical proof of his superiority over the previous travelogue writers and the French who had been collecting far longer than he had. Now, I think it's important to note as well, the center of his book is about rivalry, and Belzoni's novel is littered with references to a Mr. Dravetti who's pictured at the bottom of the pyramid in the three pictures. And although both Dravetti and Belzoni were Italians, Dravetti served under Napoleon and he expressed loyalty to the French, and Belzoni actively collected for the British. Now, Belzoni, he saw himself as a champion for the British, opposed by Dravetti collecting for the French. And in his novel, he recounts the escalation of their rivalry, from statue smashing all the way up to attempted assassinations. And after numerous accounts such as these, Belzoni demonstrates how he literally put his life on the line for Britain. Now, I think I should take a moment for a second to talk about how Belzoni often does stop and describe what he's seeing. He encounters new monuments, new ruins, and he describes them in great detail, and so he adds to the network of information in that way. However, his descriptions are often overshadowed as the public chooses to focus on the story of French-British rivalry. Now, adding to Belzoni's fame and further alienating the existing network of information was the publication of a children's book entitled Fruits of Enterprise, as you can see here, published in 1821 by Lucy Sarah Atkins Wilson. Now, in Fruits of Enterprise, Wilson gives Belzoni due credit for his scientific accomplishments in being able to open tombs, pyramids, transport artifacts, the like. Now, it should be noted here that British-French rivalry is not at the core of this book, but it does rear its head. For example, we can compare a description of French collection to Belzoni's. As you can see at the top, Dravetti's collection is described as tolerably successful. Compare that to Belzoni, who presented the world with a new and perfect monument of Egyptian antiquity. Yet more than simply celebrating Belzoni over the French, the last few sentences of this book I think are important to hone in because they clearly show that there's a sense of ownership over ancient Egypt. Now, these lines are from one of the boys in the book, and he's trying to conclude with this idea that Belzoni opened Egypt to the world, which I think already is a little ironic because that's what we see the monthly review saying Denon had done, but now here they're giving the credit to Belzoni. But these words are key to the celebration of Belzoni. Without him, some of the greatest accomplishments to date, opening up a pyramid, uncovering the Valley of the Kings, it wouldn't have been accomplished for the next 1,000 years. And this quote is a bold statement to say the least. But it still reflects the common perception that the French had been in Egypt far longer than the British. But this one man had done in 3 years what the French had failed to do in 2 decades. Thus, in celebrating Belzoni, the British actively asserted their dominance over the French. Now, just as Belzoni's book was an opportunity to take a stance on which country held intellectual superiority over ancient Egypt, the French used the publication of the Description de l'Egypte to assert their dominance. Now, work on this began immediately after Bonaparte issued a decree in February 1802. This called for the publication of all the notes, observations, drawings, maps, and all the other materials compiled by the savants in Egypt, and it was paid for by the French government. Now, it was a monumental endeavor that its creation began in 1802, but none of it was seen until 1809. And then from 1809 to 1829, several tombs were added to the description. It was a very carefully crafted and executed project that aimed to embody absolute perfection. Every drawing, text, word was submitted to an Assemblée Générale de Collaborators and was carefully scrutinized. In its final form, it included 10 folio volumes, 2 atlases, 837 copper engravings, and over 3,000 illustrations. The document itself was so grand that people who owned this colossal work might order a cabinet of mahogany, as you see on the left, to accommodate the set. Its least expensive copy was 750 francs and most expensive, 1,350, not including the additional 1,000 if you bought the cabinet. Now, because of its cost, we see that it was clearly an example of luxury, but the description was meant to reflect a higher caliber than the travelogues. In fact, one of the notable differences between the travelogues and the description was the plate's attention to detail. On the left, I have selected 3 images from the description, and on the right, this is the type of image you would see if you opened up any of the travelogues, but this one is taken specifically from Belzoni's. Now you can see that the travelogue images, they're interesting, they're intriguing, they're colorful, but the French plates are precise. And the monumental description could include images nothing below perfection. In fact, these images are so perfect that Egyptologists are able to use this as a source today. And they were able to achieve this perfection through the invention of the Conte machine. And it was developed in 1803 by Nicolas Jacques Conte. Now, this machine was used to help automate the engraving process, and essentially it was just invaluable to the description. His machine achieved a degree of perfection that no artist could hope to replicate. Now, another notable difference is that the publication of the description could be lengthy. It could be expensive, as it was financed by the government rather than a publishing house. And the length and the precision of the description imply that it is an all-knowing and comprehensive document. And I think it's best said by David Prochska, the overwhelming impression of these huge folio volumes is what we know, not what we do not. And he later goes on to say that the description has an encyclopedic gaze. And I think that the description was meant to be similar to an encyclopedia. The travelogues, however, were about the process of collecting ancient Egypt and creating a network of information. This is not to say that the description didn't add to it. It certainly improved it. However, the reason for its inception was to rebrand the Napoleonic expedition as a cultural success and try to prove their intellectual authority over ancient Egypt. Now, in conclusion, in undertaking this comparative study of textual description, I have been able to uncover a network of information that I've found that both the British and the French actively contributed to. However, Belzoni's book and the description prefer to spotlight their individual nation's intellectual superiority rather than add to this network of information. So we see this network of information become overshadowed by British-French rivalry as each nation tries to assert their dominance. So thank you so much for listening and hear me nerd out. I really appreciate your attention.